They don't know I'm making this tape. If they did, I'd already be dead. My name isn't Eris Thorn. It hasn't been for nearly 60 years. The life I'm living is a fabrication, a meticulously crafted lie provided to me by the same people who buried the truth under 1,000,000 tons of Alaskan permafrost. They gave me a new name, a new history, a quiet life in a town where no one asks questions. They thought that would be enough. They thought silence could contain it. They were wrong. The real me, the man I was, died in 1963, on a glacier at the top of the world. I'm just the echo that survived. I'm sitting here now, in the only place I feel truly safe, a place I built myself, piece by painful piece, over the course of 30 years. It's a basement room, 10 feet by 12, encased in a foot of reinforced concrete and lined with 2 layers of lead sheeting. The door at the top of the stairs is solid steel, a bank vault door I salvaged from a demolition site, and it's secured by 3 deadbolts and a combination lock whose numbers exist only in my mind. The air in here is stale, thick with the smell of old paper, the faint, sharp tang of ozone from the humming electronics, and the lingering scent of my own fear, which I think has permanently bonded with the concrete dust over the decades. The only light comes from a single, bare, 60-watt bulb hanging from a cord, casting long dancing shadows that make the room feel both smaller and infinitely larger than it is. In front of me, on a heavy wooden desk, sits the machine. It's an Ampex 351, a beautiful old reel-to-reel recorder, a relic from their era. I've kept it running all these years, sourcing vacuum tubes and replacement parts from collectors and enthusiasts, because I trust it. It's a physical medium. It can't be wiped remotely. It can't be hacked. The truth, once imprinted onto its magnetic tape, will have a ghost of a chance. The 2 large reels are turning slowly, silently, pulling the brown ribbon of tape past the recording head. The only sound in this tomb is the gentle whir of its motors and the faint hiss of the tape itself, a sound like a distant, cosmic wind. I'm making this recording because the silence has started to fray. The patterns are starting again. I see them, not in headlines, but in the spaces between the lines. A brief mention in a scientific journal from a team in Antarctica, noting a localized, unexplained energy sink before their communications went dead. A garbled report about a mining operation in the Siberian deeps that was abandoned overnight, the equipment left to rust in the tunnels. A shortwave broadcast I picked up 2 weeks ago, on a frequency that has been silent since the Cold War, broadcasting a series of numbers in a familiar, chilling sequence. They're looking for it again. Or maybe it's looking for them. For us. I feel it sometimes, a deep thrum of wrongness in the world, an itch in the back of my skull that feels like the memory of absolute zero. It's a phantom sensation, a cold that has nothing to do with the temperature. It's the cold of the void. 60 years they've kept the secret. 60 years I've honored my side of the bargain, living as a ghost in a life that isn't mine. But they're all dead now, the men in gray suits who gave me my new name. They died in their beds, of old age and heart attacks, their secrets intact. But the thing they tried to bury didn't die. It doesn't know how. And someone else needs to understand what we found. Someone needs to know why the fire gave no heat. So I'll break my silence. I'll speak the truth into this microphone, and let the magnetic particles on this tape be my only witness. I'll go back to the beginning. Back to the man I was. A physicist, 38 years old, arrogant in my understanding of the universe. A patriot who believed in the mission. A fool who had no idea he was about to step off the edge of the world. It all began in the winter of 1963, on a cold, gray morning when I was told to pack for a trip north. Very far north. The journey to the place they called Station Boreas wasn't a single trip. It was a deliberate, multi-stage descent into nothingness, a systematic peeling away of the known world. It began with a commercial flight to Fairbanks, a city that already felt like an outpost on the edge of a vast, indifferent continent. The air there was different, thin and sharp, and the people moved with a certain economy of motion, their eyes perpetually scanning the horizon as if expecting something to emerge from the endless expanse of white. From Fairbanks, the civilian world ended. I was met not by a university contact, but by a man who introduced himself as Major Arthur Kincaid. He was carved from the same cold, hard material as the landscape itself. His eyes, the color of a frozen lake, held a deep, unnerving stillness. His handshake was a brief, powerful clamp of bone and sinew. He spoke in clipped, efficient sentences that left no room for questions. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his breath fogging in the frigid air of the private airfield, "the aircraft is ready. We fly in 10. The aircraft was a C-47 Skytrain, a ghost of a bygone war, its aluminum skin stripped of all markings and painted a flat, non-reflective gray. It looked less like a plane and more like a scar against the snow. Inside, the cabin was a cold, vibrating metal tube that smelled of hydraulic fluid, stale coffee, and something else. The faint, metallic scent of contained fear. It was packed to the ceiling with crates. I recognized standard Arctic survival gear, scientific instruments in hardened cases, and several heavy, padlocked boxes that were marked with military ordnance codes. I was a physicist, not a soldier, but I knew what I was looking at. This was no simple geological survey. This was a paramilitary operation disguised as science. We flew for hours, a droning, monotonous journey north. Below us, the world dissolved. The sprawling, dark green forests of the interior thinned out, becoming a sparse, skeletal taiga, which in turn gave way to the utter desolation of the tundra. It was a canvas of whites and grays, a world bled of all color and warmth, scarred only by the black, frozen veins of rivers. It was a landscape that didn't just feel empty, it felt actively hostile to life. Our pilot was a man named Wyatt, a civilian contractor with a face like a crumpled leather map and eyes that had seen too many empty horizons. During a long stretch of silence as Kincaid reviewed a sheaf of classified documents, Wyatt turned his head slightly. "Never flown this far north off the standard routes, Doc," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the engine's drone. Command was real specific about the coordinates. Said the landing strip was prepared. Funny thing though, the natives up here, the Inupiat, they got stories about this particular patch of ice. I gave a non-committal grunt, my mind on thermodynamic equations, not folklore. But he continued, undeterred. "They call it Toranak, means the place where the cold sleeps. They say a star fell out of the sky there, a long, long time ago. But it didn't burn. It was a cold star, a piece of the great void. It hit that glacier and just drank the heat, drank it all up. They say no animal will go near it. They say the air itself is dead. If you get too close, your shadow freezes to the ground, and you have to leave it behind to escape." I offered a placating smile, the kind a scientist gives to a layman discussing the supernatural. "Fascinating mythology. Probably a large iron meteorite under the ice, creating a magnetic anomaly. Or perhaps a geological vent releasing supercooled gases. There's always a rational explanation, Wyatt." He let out a short, dry chuckle that held no amusement. "Maybe, Doc. But my granddaddy traded with these folks for 50 years. They don't waste their breath on fairy tales. They say the thing that sleeps there ain't dead. It's just dreaming." His words hung in the vibrating air, a strange, dissonant note in the sterile world of my scientific certainty. I dismissed it, of course. My world was one of data, of measurable phenomena, of immutable physical laws. I was being sent to investigate a radar anomaly, a signal void. I wasn't being sent to fight a sleeping cold god from a native legend. And then, precisely 42 minutes before our scheduled arrival, the world of rational explanation began to unravel. It started with a high-pitched squeal in our headsets. I looked up from my notes to see the co-pilot frantically tapping the instrument panel. I unbuckled and squeezed my way into the cockpit. The sight was chaos. The needles on every single navigational instrument were behaving as if possessed. The gyroscopic compasses were spinning like tops. The magnetic compass was slamming its needle from one side of its housing to the other, a frantic, suicidal dance. The radio, which had been silent, erupted in a burst of static, and from within that static emerged a sound, a rhythmic, guttural clicking, like a warped and broken Morse code being tapped out on bone. "What in God's name is that?" Kincaid was beside me, his voice a low growl, his hand resting on the holstered pistol at his hip. "Magnetic interference, Major," Wyatt shouted over the din, his knuckles white as he fought to keep the plane level. "A storm, but like nothing I've ever seen. It's localized, it's right on top of us." But I was looking at my own equipment. I'd brought a portable, highly sensitive magnetometer and a Geiger counter. The Geiger counter was silent as a tomb. No radiation. And the magnetometer, its needle wasn't spinning. It was frozen, pinned to the absolute bottom of its scale, as if the very concept of a magnetic field had ceased to exist in our immediate vicinity. This was not a storm. This was a void, a null point. Wyatt abandoned the instruments and flew by sight and instinct, peering through the swirling snow at the barely visible terrain. Then he pointed. "There. I have visual on the ground markers." Below us, a series of dim orange lights marked out a crude landing strip in the otherwise unbroken whiteness. Next to it, 3 geodesic domes, the core of Station Boreas, stood like silent white fungi. The landing was brutal, a controlled crash onto the unforgiving frozen earth. As Wyatt cut the engines, a silence fell that was more profound and more deafening than the roar that had preceded it. It was an absolute, crushing absence of sound. We opened the main cabin door, and the cold that hit us was not a temperature. It was a presence. A dry, predatory cold that felt like it was physically leeching the energy from my body. We stood on the ramp, Kincaid, myself, and a young communications tech named Miller, and stared at the camp. The floodlights were on, casting a sterile white glare over everything. The generator hummed its steady, monotonous tune, but nothing moved. No one came to greet us. The entire camp looked like a model, a perfect diorama of a place where people should be, but weren't. It felt like it had been holding its breath, waiting for us, for a very, very long time. We descended the ramp, the crunch of our boots on the crystalline snow sounding unnaturally loud in the profound silence. It wasn't the sound of compressing snow. It was the sharp, brittle crackle of shattering glass. Kincaid moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his pistol now drawn and held low against his thigh. He was a soldier in his element, and his element was a place where things had gone terribly wrong. The camp was a testament to meticulous planning, a small bubble of order in a universe of chaos. The 3 main domes, birthing, science, and supply, were interconnected by heavy insulated tunnels designed to protect from a wind that wasn't blowing. The diesel generator, a massive beast of a machine, sat apart, its steady, throbbing hum the only heartbeat in this dead landscape. But the silence. My God, the silence was a physical weight. There was no wind, not even the faintest whisper, no birds, no sound of ice shifting or settling. It was a perfect vacuum of noise that made the inside of my own head feel loud, my pulse a frantic drum against my eardrums. And the smell. There was a strange tang in the air, a scent I couldn't place. It was like the air after a lightning strike, sharp with ozone, but underneath it was a cold, metallic flavor, like tasting a frozen battery terminal. It was the smell of air that had been fundamentally changed. Miller, establish a comms link with base. Kincaid's voice was a low command that barely disturbed the quiet. Thorne, you're with me. We do a preliminary sweep. We approached the entrance to the birthing dome. The door, a heavy air-locked portal, was slightly ajar, a violation of every Arctic protocol. Cold was the enemy. You never left a door open. Kincaid nudged it with his boot and it swung inward with a low groan. The scene inside was one of frozen, interrupted life. The lights were on, casting a pale, sterile glow. Several bunks were neatly made, others were in a state of disarray. An open book lay face down on a pillow. On a central table, a game of chess was half played, the pieces like tiny frozen soldiers waiting for a command that would never come. Mugs of coffee sat half empty, a thin film of ice now covering the black liquid. It was as if the occupants had simply evaporated in the middle of a breath. We moved through the connecting tunnel, our footsteps echoing unnervingly into the science dome. Here, the sense of wrongness intensified. This was my domain, a place of order and logic, and it was pristine. Banks of electronic equipment stood silent, their screens dark. Beakers and test tubes were clean and arranged in perfect rows. On a large whiteboard, complex equations were scrawled, thermodynamic formulas, quantum calculations, all circling a single stark phrase written in the center: thermal sink or thermal vampire. And it was here that the small, dissonant details began to scream at me. On the leg of a steel workbench, I saw a scratch. It wasn't an accidental gouge. It was a deliberate carving, a symbol etched into the metal with a sharp point. It was a spiral, but it was a shape that hurt to look at. Its angles were impossible, violating Euclidean geometry. It seemed to twist in on itself in a way that my mind couldn't properly map. It felt sick. Then I saw the footprints. Near the airlock, a fine dusting of snow had settled on the floor. In it were 2 perfect prints from a standard-issue Arctic boot. They led from the airlock toward the center of the dome, and then they just stopped. They didn't turn. They didn't scuff. There were no return tracks. The person had walked to that spot and ceased to exist. "Major," I said, my voice a dry croak. "You need to see this." Kincaid came over, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He stared at the footprints, then at the empty space where they ended. The muscle in his jaw worked silently. He understood. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. This was a crime scene, or something worse. At that moment, Miller's voice, tight with panic, crackled over Kincaid's radio. "Sir, I'm in the birthing dome. You need to see the log. It's still on the screen." We moved quickly back to the first dome. Miller was pointing at a ruggedized laptop on the central table. It was open to a text file, an informal log kept by the lead scientist, a man named Dr. Hansen. The entries charted a descent from scientific excitement into sheer terror. The first few were full of triumphant jargon. Day 5. Ground-penetrating radar is showing a complete signal void at 15 meters. Density readings are negative. It's like there's a hole in the universe under the ice. Preparations are underway for extraction. Spirits are high. Jensen thinks we found a crashed Soviet spy drone. The next entry, dated the following day, was different. Day 6. Extraction complete. My God. It's not technology. It's him. A man. Perfectly preserved. The skin. The hair. It's like he went to sleep an hour ago. But the readings are impossible. The cold. It's not the cold of the ice. It's an active field. We've moved him to the quarantine module for analysis. There's something mesmerizing about him. We can't stop looking. Then came the final entry. It was a single frantic line of text. The letters were mashed together, the spelling erratic. The koldishtaking, the hitjensen tuchid, im hishandishando godishand. The entry just stopped. A cold dread, far colder than the air, washed over me. The quarantine module, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Where is it? Kincaid didn't speak. He just pointed to a third tunnel leading away from the main complex to a smaller, isolated dome about 100 feet away. The air in that tunnel was palpably colder. As we approached the door, I could feel it radiating. A physical presence that pushed against my skin and seemed to sink into my bones. It was a hungry, aggressive cold. Kincaid put his shoulder to the door and shoved. It was frozen fast from the inside. He had to hit it 3 times before it broke free with a loud crack. We stepped inside. The module was empty. A large, open biocontainment carrier stood on a table in the center, its lid thrown back. But on the floor next to the table lay a small, leather-bound field journal. It was frozen solid, as hard and brittle as a piece of stone. I had to brace it against my knee and use both hands to crack it open, the frozen pages shattering like wafers of ice. There was only one entry on the first page, scrawled in a frantic, spidery hand. The words were pressed so hard into the paper that the pencil had torn through it. 4 words that rewrote the laws of physics. The fire gave no heat. The decision was made by Kincaid, a choice born from protocol in a situation that had long since abandoned all sensible procedure. We're bringing it to the main lab, he'd stated, his voice a flat, hard thing in the frozen air. We contain the anomaly, we study it. That's the mission. It was a catastrophic mistake, but we were soldiers and scientists, and we followed the logic we knew. The it was, of course, the body. The cleanup crew that had arrived on a second plane a few hours after us found it exactly where Hansen's log had indicated, in a hastily dug pit a short distance from the now abandoned quarantine module. They brought it back in a heavy, military-grade cryo container, a gleaming stainless steel sarcophagus. 2 of the grunts, burly men encased in layers of Arctic gear, carried it into the science dome, and I saw them grimace, their movements stiff and reluctant. The cold pouring off the container was not a passive thing. It was an active force, a palpable aura of pure entropy that seemed to warp the very air around it. We placed the container in the exact center of the dome. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a brilliant, no-nonsense glaciologist who had been part of my team, immediately began setting up her instruments. Evelyn was a woman who trusted data above all else. Data was clean, logical, and sane. What she found was none of those things. I watched her face as she aimed a non-contact infrared thermometer at the container. I saw the familiar look of scientific curiosity morph into a frown of confusion, then a twitch of disbelief, and finally, a mask of stark, unadulterated fear. Her hand began to tremble. "No," she whispered, the word a puff of white vapor. That's not possible. The sensor must be broken." "What is it, Reed?" Kincaid's voice was sharp. She didn't answer. She just tapped the display with a shaking finger. Kincaid and I moved closer. The numbers on the small LCD screen glowed with an obscene, impossible light. Minus 273.1 degrees Celsius. Absolute zero, I breathed, the words feeling like sacrilege in my mouth. It's at absolute zero. "Faulty equipment," Kincaid snapped, his denial of physical force. "Run a diagnostic. Recalibrate everything." "I've calibrated it 3 times, Major!" Evelyn's voice cracked, her composure shattering. "I've tested it on a dozen different surfaces." It's accurate to 1/100th of a degree. The equipment is fine. The universe is what's broken. Absolute zero. The theoretical temperature at which all atomic motion ceases. A state that requires an infinite amount of energy to achieve. It was a thermodynamic impossibility. A concept from a textbook, not a reading on a handheld device. And yet, there it was, humming with a silent, terrible power in the middle of our sanctuary. But the true horror was not its state, it was its effect. The cold was not contained, it was a predator. I reached out a gloved hand, holding it a foot away from the steel surface. I felt it instantly, a sensation unlike any cold I had ever known. It wasn't that the air was cold, it was that the warmth was being pulled out of me. It was a physical tug, a siphoning, as if my own body's heat was being unraveled and consumed by an invisible vortex. It's radiating cold, Miller, the young comms tech, stammered from the corner where he was huddled. That's not physically possible, Evelyn corrected him, her voice a strained academic whisper. Cold is the absence of energy. It cannot be radiated. This thing, it's an energy sink. It's actively and aggressively absorbing thermal energy from its environment. And her words were proven true, with terrifying speed. The Science Dome was equipped with 3 powerful electric space heaters, which had been working overtime to keep the interior at a tolerable temperature. The one closest to the container was the first to die. Its glowing red coils flickered, dimmed, and went dark. There was no sound, no spark. The heat it was generating was simply being swallowed before it could radiate more than an inch from its source. Kincaid kicked it, a gesture of pure, frustrated rage. 20 minutes later, the second heater went out. Then the third. Our breath, which had been invisible just an hour before, now plumed in thick white clouds in the dome's interior. A delicate, crystalline lattice of frost began to grow across the instrument panels and the metal legs of the tables. "We have to get it out of here, Arthur," Evelyn pleaded, her arms wrapped around herself, her body shaking uncontrollably. "We're bringing the entire camp's temperature down." "Orders are to analyze it on site," Kincaid retorted, but the iron certainty in his voice was rusting, corroded by the impossible reality in front of him. "We can't just throw our primary objective out into the snow." "We are already in the snow!" she shrieked, her voice echoing with hysteria. "It's just following us inside!" I looked at the container. For 10,000 years it had lain in the frozen heart of the glacier, a place of stable, extreme cold. It was in equilibrium. We had ripped it from that equilibrium and brought it into our world, a world practically boiling with the heat of life and technology. We had rung a dinner bell. Kincaid, finally seeing the logic of survival over the logic of orders, relented. "All right, get it out. Take it 100 yards out east of the camp. Leave it there." The 2 soldiers who had carried it in approached it again, their faces pale with dread. The moment their gloves touched the steel, a thick layer of frost bloomed across the fabric. They carried it with frantic haste, their movements stiff with a cold that was seeping through the thickest insulation. We all followed, stepping out of the relative shelter of the dome into the Arctic night. The sky was a terrifying, beautiful tapestry of stars, so clear and bright they seemed close enough to touch. And in the middle of our small, fragile island of light and life, the soldiers placed the container. A black box in a universe of white. "There," Kincaid said, the word a cloud of relieved vapor. "The problem is outside now." But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the air, that he was wrong. We hadn't taken the problem outside, we had just put it in a bigger room. I stared at the spot where they had left it, a patch of darkness in the starlit snow. And I watched as the field expanded. It was visible now, a subtle shimmering in the air, a distortion like a heat haze in reverse. The cold was a living thing, a non-visible organism, and we had just released it from its cage into an all-you-can-eat buffet. And in the absolute godlike silence of that Arctic night, I had the distinct and terrifying impression that we were being watched, not by eyes, but by a vast and patient hunger. The illusion of safety that came from moving the container lasted less than an hour. We retreated to the common dome, a false sense of victory making our movements light, our voices a little too loud. We brewed coffee, the hot liquid a welcome shock to our chilled bodies, but it cooled in our mugs with an unnatural swiftness, going from scalding to lukewarm in under a minute. We were living on borrowed time, on borrowed heat, and the interest rate was about to become astronomical. Kincaid, a man who found comfort in plans and procedures, was hunched over a topographical map, plotting out search grids for… what? More bodies? More impossible artifacts? Evelyn sat cross-legged on her bunk, a laptop open, her fingers flying across the keys as she wrote what I knew would be the most insane scientific report of her life, a document that would likely end her career if it ever saw the light of day. And I sat apart, my mind a maelstrom of half-forgotten equations and haunting memories from Project Winter Dream. In that sterile Nevada lab, we had been gods for a fraction of a second, creating a pinpoint of absolute entropy before it had collapsed, taking two of my colleagues with it. We had peered into the abyss, and the abyss had taken a bite. Now, I realized, we hadn't just peered into it. We had brought a piece of it home. Morning came not with the sun, which barely troubled the horizon in this season, but with a growing, undeniable sense of dread. The cold had not receded. It had consolidated its territory and was preparing for a new offensive. The snow around the container was no longer snow. It had undergone some horrifying phase transition, becoming a sheet of black, glassy ice that seemed to drink the pale light. The air above it no longer shimmered. It writhed, a visible distortion of reality. The generator. Miller's voice was a strained whisper. Listen. We all fell silent. The steady, reassuring thrum of the diesel engine was gone. In its place was a sick, stuttering cough, a rhythmic struggle of machinery fighting a losing battle. We rushed outside. The generator, the very heart of our continued existence, was dying. Kincaid, ever the mechanic, ripped open the access panel. "The fuel line is freezing solid," he grunted, his words punctuated by the engine's spasms. "The heating element is running full blast, but it's not enough. It's like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol." The cold was no longer just a field. It was an infection. It was seeping into our technology, ignoring our defenses, breaking our machines from the inside out. By midday, the temperature inside the domes was back below freezing. We were wearing our full outdoor gear just to sit at a table. Desperation was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. It was the feeling of being trapped on a sinking ship, watching the water rise knowing there are no lifeboats. It was in this atmosphere of encroaching doom that Kincaid made his fateful decision. It was a decision born of humanity's most ancient instinct, a primal response to darkness and cold. "We build a fire," he declared, his voice ringing with a desperate, defiant energy. "A massive one. Right here, in the center of the camp. We'll create a wall of pure thermal energy. A fire break. Fire is the oldest weapon we have. We will fight heat with heat." The idea was so simple, so elemental that it felt like salvation. We threw ourselves into the task with the frantic energy of the condemned. We tore apart empty supply crates, gathered spare lumber, even sacrificed a spare wooden bunk frame. We built a pyre worthy of a Viking king, a mountain of wood piled high in the space between the three domes, a deliberate challenge to the thing that sat waiting in the dark. The physical labor was a relief. a way to generate our own heat, to feel a sense of agency, of control. When it was done, a structure of wood and hope that stood taller than a man, Kincaid took a 5-gallon jerrycan of gasoline and drenched the entire pyre. The fumes were sharp and intoxicating in the frigid air. "Everyone back!" he commanded, his face grim in the twilight. He raised a flare gun, pointed it at the pyre, and fired. There was a whoosh, a flash of red light, and then the world erupted in flame. The bonfire was magnificent, a roaring, raging vortex of heat and light. It climbed 20-30 feet into the sky, a column of pure, defiant energy. The sound was a deafening roar that shook the very air, a triumphant battle cry against the encroaching cold. We all took a step forward, our faces bathed in the glorious orange glow, our hands outstretched to receive the blessing of its warmth. And we received nothing. There are moments in life when your brain, your senses, and the sum total of your experience all collide with a reality so fundamentally wrong that the system simply crashes. This was one of those moments. We stood before a raging inferno, a pillar of fire so intense that its light bleached the color from the surrounding snow. And we were freezing. I was no more than 10 feet from the base of the fire, close enough that in any normal reality my eyebrows would have been singed off, and I could still see the plume of my own breath hanging in the air before me. I stripped off my heavy outer glove and extended my bare hand. I felt nothing. No wave of heat, no comforting warmth. The air between my skin and the dancing 20-foot flames was as profoundly cold as the air behind me. It was a complete and total negation of one of the universe's most basic principles. I could see the fire. I could hear its roar. I could smell the sharp scent of burning pine. But the primary product of combustion, the thermal energy, was simply absent. It was being created. I knew it was. The laws of physics demanded it. But it was being uncreated, consumed and annihilated in the instant of its birth. Miller was on his knees, weeping openly, the sounds of his despair swallowed by the fire's useless roar. Evelyn Reed was staring, her mouth agape, her scientific mind shattered into a million pieces. She was muttering, a litany of broken physics. The second law. It's violating the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy can only increase in a closed system. This isn't a closed system. It's a whole. Kincaid, a man of pure, simple action, could not process it. His mind, built on the predictable physics of ballistics and mechanics, rejected the evidence of his senses. He strode forward, right to the edge of the pyre, so close that the flames, which should have been hot enough to melt steel, licked at the front of his parka. "It's not possible," he growled, a statement of faith against an unholy revelation. He did something then that will be burned into my memory until the day I die. He thrust his gloved hand directly into the heart of the fire. I cried out, a wordless shout of alarm, but it was too late. For a single, eternal second, his hand vanished into the brilliant orange chaos. He snatched it back, his face a mask of disbelief. The glove was not burned. It was not even singed. It was covered in a thick, glittering layer of white frost. He tore the glove off, his movements frantic. His bare hand beneath was pale, waxen, and looked impossibly cold. He stood there, transfixed, looking from his frozen hand to the raging, heatless fire. And in his eyes, I saw something break. The soldier, the commander, the man of iron will, was gone. In his place was a terrified animal that had just discovered the comforting laws of its world were a lie. And in that moment of shared, silent insanity, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in my own mind. The fragmented theories from Project Winter Dream, the wild hypotheses we had dismissed as scientific fantasy, They all came rushing back. The thing in the container wasn't just a passive energy sink. It was reactive. It was drawn to energy gradients. It fed on the differential. Our fire, our grand gesture of defiance, was not a weapon. It was a banquet. The more energy we poured into the system, the more powerful its effect became. We weren't building a defensive wall. We were ringing a cosmic dinner bell and serving ourselves up as the main course. "The body," I said, my voice cracking in the cold. "It was never the body. The body is just a shell, a vessel. It's a containment unit, but it's designed to keep the cold in, not out. Inside it, the artifact, the entropic core. It doesn't generate cold. It annihilates heat. It converts energy into a state of non-existence." "What the hell are you talking about, Thorn?" Kincaid rounded on me, his terror transmuting into rage, the last defense of a man who has lost control. "This is your project, your winter dream madness. You knew this could happen." "I didn't know," I screamed back, the words tearing from my throat. "We were dealing with abstract theory. We created a field the size of a quarter for less than a nanosecond. We never imagined something like this could be a stable, natural object. This is the difference between a lightning bug and a supernova." We stood there, two men shouting uselessly at each other in a frozen, dying camp, next to a fire that mocked the very concept of fire. The light it cast was wrong, too. It was a bright, clinical light, but it created shadows that were too dark, too sharp-edged, as if the light itself was thin and starved. I looked down at the snow at the base of the fire. Not a single drop of it had melted. Not one snowflake had been disturbed. A bonfire that should have been turning the surrounding area into a slushy mess couldn't even warm the ground it stood on. It was then that the generator, which had been coughing and sputtering for hours, gave one final pathetic groan and died completely. The floodlights that had held the Arctic night at bay winked out. We were plunged into a terrifying twilight, illuminated only by the cold, false light of our impossible fire. And I knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the ground beneath my feet that we were already dead. We were just too stubborn to lie down. The death of the generator was a tipping point. It wasn't just the loss of light and what little power we had left. It was the final, definitive severing of our connection to the world of rules and reason. We were now truly isolated, adrift in an ocean of impossible cold. The entity, the artifact, the sphere, whatever it was, seemed to sense this shift. It was as if our technological defiance had been an annoyance, but our dawning, horrified understanding was an invitation. The attacks changed. They were no longer simply environmental. They became personal. The entity stopped trying to freeze us and started trying to break us. It found the cracks in our minds and began to pry them open. Miller, the young comms tech, was its first victim. He sat huddled by the dead radio, his body trembling, when his eyes went wide with a new kind of terror. "I can hear it," he whispered, his voice thin and reedy. "The voices on the radio." "There's no power, son," Kincaid said, his own voice strained, trying to hold on to the tattered remnants of command. "The radio is dead." "No," Miller insisted, shaking his head frantically. "It's not electric. It's in the air. It's the numbers stations. The ones from the training manuals. Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. But the words are wrong. They're saying my name. They're saying what happened to my brother in Korea. How did they know that? Who's broadcasting this?" He clamped his hands over his ears, but it was no use. The broadcast wasn't coming from outside. The entity had turned his own memories and training into a weapon, a ghost signal of his deepest traumas. For Evelyn Reed, the assault was more insidious, targeting the very core of her identity. She was a scientist, a woman who saw the universe as a beautiful, intricate machine governed by elegant, knowable laws. The entity showed her a new kind of beauty. She was staring at the wall of the dome, where the frost was now growing in thick, complex patterns. "Look," she breathed, her voice filled with a rapturous, terrifying awe. "The crystallography. It's impossible." We looked. The frost was not forming the familiar six-sided fractals of snowflakes. It was growing into those same non-Euclidean spirals I had seen etched on the table, forms that twisted in on themselves with a logic that was profoundly alien. "There's no hexagonal symmetry," she whispered, tracing the impossible shapes in the air with her finger. "The bond angles violate quantum mechanics. It's a form of matter that shouldn't exist. It's exquisite." She was falling in love with the monster, seduced by its perfect violation of the reality she held sacred. Kincaid pulled her back when she tried to touch it, his face a grim mask. For him, the attack was blunt and direct, tailored to a soldier's mind. The shadows cast by our cold fire began to move with a purpose of their own. "Contact," he growled, pointing a shaking finger into the darkness beyond our camp. 2 o'clock. A fire team, moving along the ridgeline. I see them. We strained our eyes, looking into the crushing blackness. There was nothing but wind-scoured snow and rock. "Arthur, there's nothing there," I said as gently as I could. "Don't tell me what I'm seeing, Thorn," he snarled, his hand reflexively going to his sidearm. "I've spent 20 years learning to spot a man in the dark. They're out there. Soviet Spetsnaz, maybe. They're waiting, probing our defenses." His Cold War paranoia, the very skill that had kept him alive for decades, had been turned into a cage. He was fighting ghosts, shadows born of his own deepest fears. And then there was me. It had saved a special kind of torment for me. It reached back through the years and pulled forth the ghost of Project Winter Dream. I started hearing them. The faint, whispered voices of Chen and Peterson, the 2 physicists who had died in the lab. I heard the final, terrified shout of my mentor, Dr. Abel, as the containment field collapsed. I could smell it too. The phantom scent of ozone and vaporized electronics that had haunted my nightmares for 3 years. The walls between the Alaskan Glacier and the Nevada desert began to dissolve. The entity was not just projecting these things, it was forcing me to relive them. The final brutal stroke came as I was staring into the cold flames, desperately trying to think, to find a flaw in its power, a loophole in the laws it was breaking. I saw him. Dr. Abel standing on the other side of the fire, his form shimmering and indistinct, a projection of pure memory and guilt. "You could have stopped it, Eris." His voice was not angry, but filled with a profound, bottomless sorrow. "You saw the energy fluctuations. You knew we were pushing the core into instability. You said nothing." "I tried to warn you," I cried out, scrambling to my feet. The others stared at me as if I were a madman. "I told you the magnetic containment was failing." "You whispered when you should have shouted," the specter said, its form flickering. "And your silence opened a door. You showed it the way. You let it taste our world." It then raised a shimmering hand and pointed toward the darkness where the container lay. "But you can fix this, Eris. You can close the door. You must overload it. Use the thermite charges. A massive, instantaneous release of energy. It will force a catastrophic failure in its metabolism. It's the only way. Fight fire with a bigger fire." It was a lie. I knew on a deep primal level that it was a lie. It was like trying to cure a fever by setting the patient on fire. But the logic was seductive. It was a plan. It was action. In a situation of complete powerlessness, the illusion of a viable action is the most potent drug in the world. The entity wasn't just trying to scare us to death. It was trying to trick us into committing suicide. It was preying on our most human instinct, The desperate, irrational need to do something. I looked from my personal ghost to my living comrades. Kincaid aiming his pistol at phantoms in the dark. Evelyn sketching impossible geometries with a rapturous expression. Miller rocking back and forth, lost in a radio broadcast from hell. We weren't a team anymore. We were a collection of broken minds, each trapped in a bespoke reality of torment. And the thing in the dark knew it had won. The games were over. It was time for the feast to begin. The lie planted by my own ghost took root in the fertile ground of Kincaid's desperation. A plan involving thermite, overwhelming force, and a direct assault. It was a language he understood. It was a way to fight back. "The thermite charges," he said, his voice a low, guttural rasp, his eyes catching the cold light of the fire with a feverish intensity. "We have 3 in the supply tent. M14 incendiary grenades. They burn at 4,000 degrees. They can melt through an engine block. We hit it with all 3 at once." "Arthur, for God's sake, no!" I grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into the thick fabric of his parka. "It's a trick. It's what it wants. You'll be feeding it a 3-course meal." "And your plan is what, Thorn?" He ripped his arm away, his strength startling. "To sit here and write poetry about it, while we turn into human popsicles? I am a soldier. I will not die on my knees." He was beyond reason. He was a cornered animal, and he was going to go down fighting, even if the fight itself was the very thing that would kill him. He stormed off toward the supply dome, a man on a mission, a man marching proudly toward his own execution. I tried to follow, to argue, but Miller suddenly lunged, grabbing my legs, his face a mess of tears and frozen snot. "Don't let him!" he shrieked. "The voices say it will be the end. They say the fire will wake the sleeper." His mad ramblings held more truth than Kincaid's military doctrine, but it was too late. Kincaid returned, a small, deadly cylinder in each hand. He was a high priest of destruction, about to make a sacrifice to an unknown and hungry god. "Everyone get back!" he roared, his voice the crack of doom. He moved to the edge of the dying light of our bonfire, his form silhouetted against the useless flames. He armed the first grenade with a practiced twist, swung his arm back, and launched it in a high, graceful arc into the darkness. We watched it fly, a tiny messenger of our own demise, tumbling end over end until it landed with a soft thud in the snow near the invisible anomaly. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, the grenade detonated. There was no sound, no explosion. Just a silent, violent eruption of pure white light. It was a sun being born and dying in the same instant, a flash so brilliant it seared my retinas even through squeeze-shut eyelids. In that single silent moment, the entire landscape was illuminated with impossible clarity. Every ice crystal, every rock, every line of terror on every face. And then the light was gone. And the cold that followed was not a temperature. It was a physical impact, a concussive wave of absolute entropy. It was the feeling of all the heat in the universe being sucked into a single point. Our bonfire did not go out. It was devoured. The flames, which had been weakly flickering, were drawn inward, collapsing into a tiny blue spectral flicker before vanishing completely, leaving a pile of blackened, instantly frozen logs. All sound ceased. The world went utterly black and utterly silent. And in that ringing silence we heard a new sound, a deep, resonant crack, like a giant bone snapping. It came from the direction of the artifact. Kincaid, lost in his battle rage, didn't hesitate. He threw the second grenade, then the third. 2 more silent, world-shattering flashes of light. And with each flash, the cold intensified, the wave of nothingness washing over us, growing stronger. I felt the air thicken, becoming viscous and heavy in my lungs. Breathing was like inhaling powdered glass. The metal zipper on my jacket became so supernaturally cold that it burned my chin through my scarf. And then, in the faint starlight, we saw it. The cryo container, the steel box we thought held the anomaly, was being destroyed from the inside out. The cracking sound was the metal itself, fracturing under stresses that no material was designed to withstand. It buckled, warped, and then, with a soft, final implosion, it disintegrated. The steel walls dissolved into a fine gray dust that hung in the air for a second before freezing solid and falling like snow. The body was gone, vanished. There was nothing. Except, in the center of the glassy, blackened patch of ground where the container had been, something now rested. It was small, no bigger than a man's clenched fist. It was a perfect sphere, crafted from a material that was the color of a starless midnight sky. It did not reflect the faint starlight. It seemed to swallow it. It was a hole in the fabric of space, a point of absolute three-dimensional blackness. And the cold, the entirety of that impossible, universe-breaking cold was now emanating from that one tiny object. The field was no longer diffuse. It was a focused, concentrated beam of pure entropy, and it was expanding with horrifying speed. The supply dome was the first to go. We watched, mesmerized, as a wave of white frost washed over it. The canvas became brittle, and then the entire structure groaned and collapsed inward, its metal struts snapping like frozen twigs. Then the science dome, then the birthing dome. The wave of absolute zero was rolling towards us, a visible wall of encroaching death. Kincaid stood frozen, staring at the sphere, the empty grenade pins still clutched in his hand. The warrior's fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by the dead, glassy emptiness of total comprehension. He had not fought the enemy. He had hatched it. "Run," he breathed, the word a frozen prayer. But there was nowhere to run to. We were standing on a tiny, shrinking island in an ocean of nothing. There was no escape. The Arctic night offered no shelter, only a vast, indifferent emptiness that stretched for 1,000 miles in every direction. The plane, our only link to a sane world, was a mile away, an impossible distance across a landscape that was actively trying to erase us. The cold was a visible entity now, a creeping, shimmering frost line that advanced across the snow, turning everything it touched into a brittle, glassy parody of itself. Our only sanctuary, if it could be called that, was the small patch of ground where our fire had failed. For some reason, the entropic field was weaker there, as if the memory of heat had left a faint, protective residue. We huddled together on the blackened snow, a pathetic nod of dying warmth, our backs pressed together for a comfort that was purely psychological. 4 of us: Kincaid, Reed, Miller, and me. 4 flickering candles in a hurricane of absolute zero. In the center of it all, the source of our damnation, lay the sphere. It was utterly still, utterly silent, a perfect, black pearl of cosmic horror. Its stillness was more terrifying than any movement. It didn't need to move. It was a fundamental constant of the universe, and we were the fleeting anomaly. The raw, animal panic began to fade, replaced by a strange and terrible serenity. The kind of calm that comes when all hope is extinguished. You stop fighting. You simply are. And then you are not. The process of freezing to death began. I felt it first in my extremities. My fingers and toes went from aching to numb, a slow, creeping anesthesia. They ceased to be a part of me, becoming distant, alien objects attached to my limbs. The numbness crawled up my arms and legs, a slow tide of cellular death. I tried to flex my hands, to move my feet, but the signals from my brain seemed to get lost in the frozen nerves. My muscles were stiff, unresponsive, like cold clay. Miller had stopped his rocking and moaning. He sat with his knees drawn to his chest, staring into the dark with wide, unseeing eyes. Frozen tears clung to his lashes like tiny diamonds. Evelyn, ever the scientist, fought it to the very end. Her fingers, barely able to bend, were still trying to write in her notebook. Her handwriting was a spidery, illegible scroll. Entropic cascade. Localized temporal stasis. Affecting observation, she muttered, her lips blue and stiff. She was documenting her own dissolution. Then the pencil dropped from her grasp. She stared at her hand for a long moment, not with fear, but with a kind of detached, scientific curiosity. Then her head slumped forward onto her chest. She simply stopped. Kincaid remained standing the longest, a monument of sheer, stubborn will. He faced the sphere, his jaw set, his body rigid. He was a soldier on his final watch, facing an enemy that had already won. I watched the frost form a silver filigree in his beard and eyebrows. I watched his breath come in ever shallower, ever slower clouds of vapor. Finally, his legs gave out from under him, not buckling, but stiffly collapsing like a statue being toppled. He hit the ground with a hard, dull thud and did not move. And then there was one. I was alone with the abyss. I sat there, my back against Kincaid's frozen, solid form, and stared at the small black sphere. The phantoms in my head were gone. The voices, the hallucinations, they had all vanished. The psychological warfare was over. There was no need for it anymore. The game was won. And in the perfect, ringing silence, a final understanding bloomed in my dying mind. It wasn't an equation or a theory. It was an intuition, a moment of terrible clarity. The sphere wasn't evil. It wasn't malevolent. It was simply hungry. It was a law of nature given physical form, a localized, weaponized version of the heat death of the universe. It didn't hate us. It was as indifferent to us as a star is to the planets that orbit it. We were just fuel. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy. The urge to sleep, to surrender to the soft, warm feeling darkness of the final stage of hypothermia, was overwhelming. I knew that was the end. You feel warm, you get drowsy, and you just drift away. A merciful death. I closed my eyes. I thought of my wife's face, my son's laugh, the feeling of sun on my skin. I let go, but some small, stubborn part of my brain, the physicist that refused to die, screamed one last frantic question. It doesn't just cool, it feeds. What is consciousness? What is thought? What is life itself? Not just chemistry. It's a cascade of complex electrochemical signals. It is energy. I was the last source, the last spark of complex energy in its immediate vicinity. It wasn't just waiting for me to freeze. It was savoring me. It was slowly sipping the last dregs of my consciousness, the fading electrical fire of my thoughts and memories. I was its after-dinner cordial. And that thought, that final obscene violation, sparked a rage that burned hotter than any fire. A pure, cold, intellectual fury. I would not be its meal. I would not be a footnote in its cosmic feast. With an effort of will that felt like lifting a mountain, I forced my eyes open. I stared at the sphere, and I did the only thing I could. I stopped giving it what it wanted. I stopped thinking of warmth and life. I emptied my mind. I embraced the void. I used the old meditative techniques they taught us at the agency for resisting psychic interrogation. I built a wall of pure, cold, emotionless thought in my mind. I became a rock. I became as empty and as cold as it was. And I waited. Time ceased to have meaning. but I felt it. A subtle shift in the attention. The intense pressure on my consciousness lessened. I was no longer a delicious, complex meal. I had become uninteresting. I had become a stone. Then, with the last ounce of my strength, the last spark of defiance, I did one more thing. I focused my entire being on a single thought. The plane. Our C-47 Skytrain, a mile away. Its fuel tanks, filled with hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, a massive, concentrated store of delicious chemical energy just sitting there, waiting for a spark. I projected that thought, that image, that location, with every fiber of my being. I didn't know if it could hear or sense me. It was a dying man's desperate final gambit. And the sphere, it moved. It didn't roll. It didn't slide. It levitated. It rose a foot off the glassy snow, and with a smooth, silent, and utterly purposeful motion, it began to drift away. It floated past me, and for a second I felt the fabric of space itself seem to bend around it. Then it was gone, a speck of absolute blackness disappearing into the greater darkness of the Arctic night. The cold did not vanish, but its focused, predatory intensity was gone. I could breathe again, a ragged, painful gasp. I lay among the frozen statues of my friends, a lone survivor on a dead world, listening to the sound of my own failing heart. I don't know how long I lay there, a half-frozen relic in a museum of death. Time had fractured into a crystalline, meaningless thing. The stars wheeled overhead in a slow, indifferent dance. The sphere was gone, but the cold it had left behind was a permanent stain on the world, a deep, abiding chill that had settled into the very rock and ice. The camp was a ghost town preserved in crystal, the domes like the frozen carapaces of dead insects. My comrades were perfect statues, their faces peaceful in a way that was more horrible than any expression of terror. I felt no grief. I felt nothing at all. My emotions had been flash frozen and shattered. Then a new sound intruded on the silence. A low, distant drone that slowly grew into the familiar, life-giving roar of an aircraft engine. I turned my head, an agonizingly slow movement, and saw its lights on the horizon. A rescue team. Or so I thought. I learned later they were what the agency called a debriefing and sanitation crew. They found me more dead than alive, my body temperature in the low 80s, my heartbeat a faint, fluttery thing. The fact that I was wedged between the larger, frozen bodies of Kincaid and Reed had, ironically, saved my life, shielding me from the worst of the ambient cold. The next period of my life is a blur of sterile white rooms, the sting of needles, and the soft, insistent murmur of questions from men with empty eyes. First, the military hospital in Anchorage. Then, a windowless room deep inside a secure facility at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. This was the true culmination of Operation Boreas, not the terrifying confrontation with a cosmic entity, but the quiet, soul-crushing horror of a bureaucratic cover-up. I told them everything. The impossible cold, the heatless fire, the psychological attacks, the sphere. I told them about its hunger. They listened with a polite, unnerving patience, their faces betraying no shock, no disbelief. They made notes on yellow legal pads. They never interrupted. When my hoarse voice finally gave out, the senior man, a gaunt figure in a gray suit who looked like he had been carved from smoke and secrets, folded his hands on the table. "That's a remarkable story, Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "A truly fascinating and detailed account of stress-induced hallucination." And then he told me the official story. Operation Boreas encountered a sudden, unforecasted polar vortex, a once-in-a-century weather event. All equipment failed. The entire team tragically succumbed to the elements. All except one, Me. My survival was a miracle. My story of a black sphere was a textbook example of a mind ravaged by extreme hypothermia and oxygen deprivation. The body, the 10,000-year-old man, I croaked. Dr. Thorne, the second man said, his voice flat and hard. The preliminary excavation found nothing but anomalous ice formations. There was no body. You were disoriented. It's understandable. They were gaslighting me on a geopolitical scale. They were trying to edit my reality. And in their calm, practiced denial, I found the final, most terrible revelation of all. They knew. They knew every word I said was true. Their lack of surprise, the seamlessness of their cover story, it wasn't an invention, it was a protocol. They had dealt with this before. "What is it?" I whispered, the question feeling futile even as I asked it. The senior man leaned forward, and for a fleeting moment I saw a flicker of something in his dead eyes. It might have been pity. It might have been profound weariness. "We don't know what they are, Doctor," he said, the use of the plural sending a fresh chill down my spine. "We call them thermodynamic artifacts. We think they're tools, or weapons, or maybe the dormant components of a technology so advanced it is indistinguishable from a law of nature. Leftovers from a conflict that was fought on this planet before our species learned to walk upright. Most of the time they sleep, but sometimes something wakes them up." He leaned back, his face once again a blank mask. "Dr. Eris Thorne died a hero's death in service to his country. His wife will be well compensated. His son's education will be taken care of for life. You, on the other hand, you are going to get a new name, a new history, and a quiet job in a place where it never gets cold. You will forget you were ever a physicist. You will forget the name Boreas. You will forget everything. Because if you ever speak of this to anyone, for any reason, we can't be held responsible for what might happen. We live in a dangerous world after all. Accidents happen every day. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. They weren't a monster from the stars. They were worse. They were human beings who had looked into the abyss, seen the scale of the horror that lurks in the shadows of our world, and had decided that the most important thing was not to fight it, not to understand it, but to simply keep it a secret, to protect the system, to maintain control. We weren't explorers on a new frontier. We were disposable assets. We were the canaries they sent down a mine shaft they already knew was filled with poison gas. Our only purpose was to see how quickly we would die. And my survival was not a miracle. It was just an inconvenience that needed to be managed. And so, here I sit. The inconvenience. A ghost in a machine of their making, 60 years later. I became a competent, if unremarkable man. I lived a life of quiet desperation, the details of which are not important. The men who erased me are long dead themselves, their secrets buried with them. But the machine they served, the great and terrible edifice of silence, it grinds on. I'm an old man. My bones ache with a cold that has nothing to do with arthritis, a deep, cellular memory of that night on the ice. Sometimes, I still dream of their faces. Arthur, Evelyn, young Miller. They don't accuse me. They just stare, their eyes filled with a frozen, eternal surprise. To have survived is its own special kind of damnation. I am not making this tape for revenge. That is a hot emotion, and I have no heat left to spare. I am making it because I have come to understand that their silence is not a shield. It is a shroud. By hiding the truth of these things, they are not protecting humanity. They are leaving it defenseless. That sphere did not just vanish. I pointed it at the plane. I offered it a bigger meal. The official report lists the pilots of our C-47 as casualties of the same storm, Their plane lost without a trace. But I know what happened. The sphere fed, and it grew stronger. And it is still out there. They all are. Sleeping. Waiting. In the crushing depths of the oceans, in the frozen hearts of mountains, in the silent, forgotten places of the world, waiting for a curious hand or a desperate fool to wake them up. I am nearing the end of the tape. I will give it to the only person I dare to trust, the grandson of an old university colleague, a young investigative journalist with more courage than sense. Perhaps he will be able to get the story out. Perhaps it will be his death sentence. It is no longer in my hands. All I can do is break the silence. All I can do is offer this warning. They gave me a new name and a new life, and they ordered me to forget the old one. But I cannot. Because sometimes, late at night, when the house is still and the wind is blowing, I can almost hear a faint static on the edge of my hearing. And I know, with a certainty that freezes the marrow in my old bones, it's still listening. So that's the story. A story about how the ambition to look beyond our world resulted in a lifelong silence filled with an alien hum. A story that proves some doors are better left unopened, especially when they lead to the bottom of the Nevada desert. Officially, Project Looking Glass was defunded in 1981. But you and I both know the truth now. They didn't stop looking. They just broke the mirror. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think, or look over your shoulder, support the channel with a like and subscribe. And be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, and listen to the silence. Sometimes it has more to say than any noise.